Hello, everyone. It's lovely to see you. And thank you so much for joining us for the 27th Autumn Gathering.
Yes, yes, it is lovely to see you all. And this is a lovely way to do it. I thought we might be meeting properly because I think there's great value in the gathering itself, the sheer, enjoyment of talking to each other and sharing ideas. Hopefully we'll do that next year. We probably will do a mixture. We'll definitely gather, but we'll probably do a Zoom as well, I think, because this is working and we're outreaching to a great number of people all over the world, which we want to do. We want to promote Coole Park and Lady Gregory and South Galway generally. So it's wonderful to be able to do it. And it's really a privilege to be here. 27 successive years, actually.
And we don't look a bit old.
No, I wasn't at day one.
But I've got grey, Ronnie. I used to have red hair.
Not at all.
Okay. Just a couple of things. First of all, it just never fails to amaze me, the incredible lineup of speakers that we manage to put together every year. And their support and participation is invaluable. Indeed, it is world class. And we are very honored on Lady Gregory's behalf to have our tremendous panel, which you will hear more about. A couple of housekeeping notes. As you know, you're all supposedly on mute at the moment. Video, you don't have to turn your video off, but if you get up to get a cup of tea or something, you might like to do that, so we're not touring your good housekeeping home at the same time as you. But that's kind of it, really. The only other note for folks who would like to ask a question, and again, we've marvelous speakers, as you know, we will do Q&A at the end. So if you would like to ask a question, what we're asking you to do is use the chat function. If you just click at the bottom of the screen and put your question in there. And at the end, Melissa, our chair, will lead us through that. Is that okay? And, not only Lady Gregory would be chuffed at this Zoom gathering in her honor, but we have somebody very dear to our heart that we'd like to remember now as well.
Well, indeed, just before Christmas last year, poor Lois passed away. Now, I know she was unwell for some time, but, we actually loved Joyce very much. And we used to meet in her house to make all the plans for the various gatherings. And she and Sean were always so hospitable, but they were naturally hospitable people. Sean is still with us, thank goodness. But Lois's passing was a blow, even though we knew she wasn't well. And it was a cold December time. And we just wish to dedicate this gathering very much in Lois's memory and say hi to Sean. And it's good to talk about her and seeing her photograph there. She looks so wonderful. Yes. So good luck and thank you, Lois.
Woman, a wonderful, inspiring woman, much like Lady Gregory. And I'm eternally grateful for her having introduced me to this fabulous gathering. Another person who is absolutely inspiring is Dr. Melissa Sira, who will be our chair for this evening. And Melissa is the head of drama at Trinity College and also assistant professor. Her monograph, Marina Carr, Pastures of Unknown, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2018. She's also the editor of the volume Women in Irish Drama, A Century of Authorship and Representation, also Palgrave, and co-editor of The Dreaming Body, Contemporary Irish Theatre with Paul Murphy, which was published by our dear Colin Smythe, a great friend of the gathering. Melissa was president of the Irish Society of Theatre Research from 2011 to 2015, and she indeed researches and teaches in the field of Irish theatre, women in performance and playwriting. And many of you will remember the last in-person gathering where in Thurballylee we had the privilege of Melissa and Marina Carr hosting a workshop for playwrights. So again, Melissa, we are eternally grateful for your support and indeed your insight into Gregory and your constant research in which really not only favors the gathering, but the literary world in general. So we're eternally grateful. Melissa is also a professional dramaturg and has worked on productions of Irish plays in the US, including the Irish Rep of Chicago's productions of Carr, Friel and Shaw. And with Holly Hunter, the Pittsburgh Irish and Classical Theatre production of Carr's Portia Coughlin, and at the Abbey Theatre on Carr's area.
We just thought before we started, if Melissa would just wait a second, we want to introduce something a bit different this year, a video which Luke Morgan kindly has filmed for us, just to remind us of the inspirational landscape that is Coole. Manus Gowan sort of did the design, and my son Ben sort of put it all together. So just for a few seconds, let's drift back to Coole Park, please.
Thank you so much, Marion and Ronnie. Thank you very much. That was such a beautiful, reflective moment there, which I must say I look with mixed emotion because it makes my heart ache that we're not there. The beauty of the woods whispering to us, those apples, the colours that are there now. So I'm honoured and delighted to chair this successive 27th annual Lady Gregory Yeats Autumn Gathering. What an achievement, and what a beautiful, rich, passionate and inspiration community this is all over the world. So it's a great honor to be here now speaking with you all, and I'm delighted to see so many of you that I know and many people that I've never met, but also it's a mixed emotion because I wish we were together as well. So hopefully this time next year we should be together again. So it's with great joy that I'm opening up tonight's proceedings. We have an incredibly rich, exciting program put together as ever. And in the words of Michael Miskell in one of my favorite plays by Lady Gregory, The Workhouse Ward, he says, "All that I am craving is the talk." So without further ado, all I'm craving is to hear everybody and to open up the 27th Lady Gregory Yeats Autumn Gathering. So without further ado, we're going to start with our first speaker is Una Clancy, an outstanding actor who I and many of us here had the joy and the honor and the privilege to see playing Lady Gregory herself on the New York stage off Broadway in 2020 for the Irish Repertory of Broadway's performance, new play Lady G, Plays and Whisperings. So this of Lady Gregory, this was a beautiful production that I'll never forget. So it's wonderful to see you again, Una. Una hails from Dublin and lives in New York, and first took to the boards with Trinity Players, performing in Travesties, The Country Wife and The Lark, among other plays. For the Dublin Theatre Festival, she worked with the Movable Feast Theatre Company under the direction of Robert Gordon. In New York, she has appeared at the Irish Repertory Theatre in the much acclaimed O'Casey season, and of course, as I've mentioned most recently, as Lady Augusta Gregory herself in Lady G. She's a member of the Drilling Company, NYC, where she has performed in Hamlet, Macbeth, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and All's Well That Ends Well. With Wake Up Arts, she performed The Jester and the Dragon, a one-woman show, and Anam Cara, and A Touch of the Playwright with Ham and Clove Stage Company. So I'm delighted to hand you over to Una now, who will again bring Lady Gregory alive through her own reflections and reliving of how she created the role and her approach to Lady Augusta Gregory. Thank you, Una.
Thank you so much, Melissa. It's wonderful to be here. It's bittersweet. I can't wait to be with everybody in person next year. Hopefully they're in Cool. And thank you, Ben. What a beautiful opening to actually see those trees and those autumn leaves, the leaves in their autumn beauty. Melissa, you made me laugh there thinking about Michael Miskell, in preparation and in thinking about Lady G and the whisperings of Lady G in our production. I went back to my script yesterday and I literally was belly laughing over the workhouse ward between Miskell and McInerney and all the shenanigans. And I was in tears reading McDonagh's Wife, which both of those one-act plays were included in our production. So it's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Marion and Ronnie and everybody for this invitation. So I'm here to represent the New York production of Lady G. And to do that, I think we're going to just hop right in with a little taste from a clip from the show that Kieran O'Reilly, who sends his love and wishes he could be with us, that he took on the last night when we had to shut down because of COVID. And when we had Jane, hi Jane, and Susie and Cecile, and we had Melissa and so many of you there that night. It was an incredible honor to play to you. And so here's a little taste from the show that Ben has lined up for us.
It came to Ireland in Cromwellian times, changed it to Roxburgh. It had 6,000 acres of wide beauty and was a hive of activity, with its stables full of horses, its kennels full of sporting dogs, Gordon setters, retrievers, greyhounds, the sawmill with its carpenter and engineers, the garden so well tilled, full of grapes and melons, peaches and apples, inexhaustible fruit. I understand you have a film these days called Downton Abbey. Yes, it was like that. Of course, the house wasn't so grand. I remember we had a lot of rats, for us all the country houses did then. Years later, when I was married and at Cool Park, we had a visitor from the city who saw a rat in her bedroom when she was undressing, a rat in her mattress when she got into bed, and the next morning at breakfast discovered that one had sampled her slice of toast. She left the house, marched the 3 miles into the village of Gort, and sent herself an urgent telegram summoning her home. But Roxborough was a magical place for a young girl. I could climb a short little limestone hillock, and the level line of the Slieve Etger moorlands were open and airy to the west, and the wild Burren hills, queerly armoured in their white limestone pavements, allowed me catch a glimpse of the distant Atlantic. A brown trout stream flowed the entire 3-mile length of the estate and emptied into Galway Bay. People have often asked, when did the new Irish literary movement begin? I believe it was the moment Parnell died. That moment was the sharply defined beginning of a new era for Ireland. You see, up to that time, Ireland had been engrossed in politics and the question of subsistence. Throughout the 19th century, she had had no real literature of her own. The Irishmen who wrote novels during that century merely skimmed the surface of things. And anyway, the novel is not the natural Irish mode of expression. That mode is drama. It is through drama that the Irish genius naturally finds its expression. But with the death of Parnell came an end to the absorbing topic that had occupied Ireland's energies for so many years. The literary instinct, necessarily dormant because its expression would have found no audience, awoke and turned itself towards drama as a mode of expression. Now, a new Ireland began. The Ireland that thinks replaces the Ireland that merely fights. Artists from all corners came to visit Cool Park. I don't quite know when I decided to make a large copper beech tree in my visitor's book, but I did. I even provided the penknife to carve the autographs. Of course, I didn't offer that to every visitor. That would have killed the tree. But just enough to get me in trouble when I didn't offer it to every scribe who visited. Do you mind if I read a few to you? A.E. George Russell. J.M.S. John Millington Synge. W.B.Y. that's Willie. J.B.Y. Jack Butler Yeats, Willie's brother. A.J. Augustus John, who painted us all. S.O.C. Sean O'Casey. G.B.S. Who might that be?
I think we're back. So a little hard to capture, and God bless Kieran for trying. That was a very, very last minute attempt, but it might give you a little taste of our production. So let me just say a little about it. So the production in New York was really the vision of Kieran O'Reilly. And what he did was he took some of her writings, quite a bit of her writings actually, and then he wove the whole piece together with references to the modern day, with his own interpretation and imaginings of her exchanges with a whole host of characters, the people who were really key individuals in her life. Of course, Willie, Edward Martin, William Blunt, John Quinn, and Robert. I mean, her whole family and beyond, and all of her relationships with those key people in her life. So Kieran really brought together a beautiful script with a historical person, and with Lady Gregory, of course, it would be easy to fall into a narrative storytelling, historical piece that's really, that's largely representative, you know, that's trying to represent rather than to interpret. But Kieran, I think, did a beautiful job of both, of really leaning on the history and the historical, but art ultimately is interpretation, right? It's not imitation, it's not copying. And I'll talk a little more about that when I talk about approaching playing a character who was a historical person. So in the production itself, there were moments where Lady Gregory spoke, spoke largely from text from her autobiography, and then it was interspersed with very dynamic moments of her meeting with William Blunt, her affair with him, her affair with John Quinn. Kieran included two of her one-act plays, and in fact, the show began with her saying, with Lady G saying that she only agreed to appear, to be spirited back to forward to the Irish Repertory Theatre on condition that the Irish Rep staged her plays, which she joked didn't happen too much in her lifetime. So the play that was an incredible mix of, you know, two one-act plays, 4 actors. There was John Keating, Terry Donnelly, and James Russell, who played a host of characters, both within the plays within the play, and then everybody from William Gregory, as I said, to William Blunt, John Quinn. A host of characters were brought to life through the 4 actors and the script that Kieran had put together. In rehearsal, we had a very collaborative process. We were trimming, and Kieran was constantly directing us and trying to find ways to really bring out the dynamism of Lady Gregory, because she really was such a live wire and such a dynamic energy that the show had to reflect that in its tempo, in its energy. And so it was a wonderful, many people remarked that it wasn't a dry telling, a retelling of her life. There was a lot of the drama of the interactions and these little vignettes where she went and visited different parts of her life and the people in it. The opportunity in the script too was that, you know, as she journeyed through the retelling of her life, some of which was very robust and full of that dynamic energy, she also had this opportunity to be more reflective, or to be reflective, and to have these quiet moments in which she was questioning what happened, and in which she was sometimes correcting the record. Classically, the whole record about her husband, Gregory, her husband, William Gregory, and the misconceptions about him and his relationship to the congested district boards, and all of that that had happened during the famine, and what was sort of ascribed to him during that time. So there are all these different actions that she's taking throughout the story to correct and to rediscover and discover these different moments in her life. So without further ado, we're going to have Ben show a different color than the initial clip that you just saw. Right as COVID hit, and when we all had to go into lockdown, a university approached us to make some footage for a literary course for their Irish literature students, and to give the students something about the life of Lady Gregory. So this next clip is not from the theater itself. It's from me in lockdown, recreating some of her life and to show to these university students. So Ben, whenever you're ready with the clip, here she is in a more reflective mood.
Look at him, a wonder of the Western world. Once again, so unexpectedly in my life, my heart went thump, 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 and I fell in love. Did I love him so much? It ought to have been from all that piled up goodness of the years, yet it was not that. It was a calling that came in a moment, something impetuous and masterful about him that satisfies me and gives me perfect rest. Before I left for New York, from New York, he took me shopping, bought me a small and simple gold watch bracelet. It was beautiful, and it was from John. Back home in Galway, I wrote, just 2 months today since I said goodbye to America and to you. I have felt more profound loneliness than I have in many a year. You won me, dear John. My own John, not other people's John. I love you. I care for you. I think about you. I know you. I awake looking for you. Do right.
So interesting to hear the clock ticking there, which I hadn't realized when I first recorded that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my approach to this incredible woman and playing the role of Lady Gregory. As I said before, art is really not exactly representational. Hopefully it's interpretative. And certainly we were working with Kieran's imagination and interpretation through her eyes, but also with some interpretation. And I had to approach the blessing and the curse in a way of playing somebody from history, because there's so much that's out there. There's a lot of both mythology and also fact, sort of hard fact. And so as an artist, as an actor, I had to find my way in, and ultimately it had to be, and always has to be, about the emotional connection and having to do with not so much the hard facts of her life, although those were portrayed, but how to come from the inside out, right? So I began the process with a very strong emotional connection myself to her. As a young mother, actually, in my 30s, I had reread Cuchulainn of Muirhemne, and I was so floored by it. I just fell in love with it so much. It was kind of a reawakening, having been away from Ireland, living in America for some time. And I found myself diving back into the old Irish, the old texts and the old folklore and the stories, and the language in Cuchulainn and her spirit in the retelling, I absolutely fell in love with. So I just adored and loved what she had done and really felt her contribution in that. And then I had to also connect, and as an actor always, and think, what in this evening, in this retelling, in this moment in which Willie Yeats sort of conjures her up at the beginning of the show, which was Kieran's conception of the show, that I would begin as an actor, but then say, more or less that Willie had conjured me up and say, here I am. Now let me tell you that I needed to find my own reason that was similar, that I felt was Lady Gregory's reason, her objective in coming back. And so there were actions that I was pursuing, things that I wanted, and that the stakes were high, that if I didn't achieve what I came to achieve, that something would really be lost. And if I gained what I came back here to achieve in the telling of my life, that something, we would all be left the richer, and so would I. So I worked with that a lot, actually. I felt, as I got to know her, through all my researches with her, and James's work was very helpful with that, James Pethica's work. I read her 70 Years. I had read O'Casey's autobiography for the O'Casey season, and I felt very steeped in that world. And I loved, I felt I could sort of smell the Dublin streets, and I could smell and taste the time through the writings of O'Casey and through Lady Gregory's own pen. But ultimately, I had to be in pursuit of something as an actor on stage for every moment and looking for something. So that I had to make some choices as an actor. And so I chose that I really needed to remember. And it wasn't hard to do because I felt that Lady Gregory, more than anything, always was learning, always wanted to learn and make new discoveries, and always wanted to serve. So those were the two linchpins that really were the strongest thing and from which I could make new discoveries every night and in every rehearsal, because there's always a new way to remember, a new way to discover, and a new way to be of service, to be of use. So that was really how I approached the role. I was entering into it from the top of the show with the feeling that I'm going to recollect everything for you and for myself, that there's a new opportunity here. I've jumped into the 21st century, and so I can speak more freely. I can bear my heart, come out of a kind of shyness that I felt that she had, and I can take a risk. So that was really what kept things very much alive for me. And I think I'm just gonna, there are, I could talk about this all day and night. There were so many other parts to my preparation, working through my body. Of course, the most valuable thing was rehearsal, Kieran's promptings and directions, and being with other actors. The fact that there were 4 of us together, feeding each other and bringing new light to different aspects of her and each other was just incredible. So I'm going to finish up my section here with what for me is the heart of Lady Gregory, and beautifully captured by Kieran in this choice that he made to end the show after we've watched Macdonough's wife being played out on the stage with this incredible plea for the power of words, for the power of music, for the life of the artist and what it has to contribute to our society and how much it's needed, and her summing up of her own feeling about her life and ultimately her wish to be of service. So Ben, if you have this last clip, these are the last words of our New York City production of Lady Gregory. Thank you.
It brought to mind to me the words of the poet about artists. We are the music makers, and we are the dreamers of dreams, wandering by lone sea breakers and sitting by desolate streams, world losers and world forsakers, upon whom the pale moon gleams. Yet we are the movers and shakers of the world forever, it seems. I think we will end on that note. I do think that I have been of use to the country. I know that I have left a sheaf of papers that have contained their quota of golden grain. I have been but the reaper. The ripened ears come from the poor, from the people. Some that ripen the harvest come from beyond the sun. I can claim diligence and love for the work, for the people, for the abbey, for Ireland that constraineth me to do service as I may. A short time before I died, I wrote a note to you, Willie, which I understand was never sent and you never received. I say it to you now. It may be that the time has come for me to slip away. I have had a full life, and except for the grief of parting with those who are gone, a happy one. My last years have been made fruitful by you and your friendship, in work and in service. I remain ever yours, Lady Augusta Gregory.
Oh, thank you so much, Una. I have goosebumps looking at you there and seeing how you bring this magnificent woman alive for us. And those clips that you chose for us really show the levels, the depths, the nuances, the beauty, the intricacy, the poetic power, and the transformation, and her belief in the power of the artist, but also in herself as an artist. So thank you so much. And the power of yourself as an artist, Una. Thank you. It's quite astonishing to see you bringing alive this woman. So I'm dying to hear more. I mentioned, and we'll talk to you, Una, at the end. We're going to have all the questions in the question and answer session at the end. So if you could enter your questions, please, in the chat function. That'd be great. So thank you so much, Una. And I'm going to move on now to our next speaker, who Una has referred to, the illustrious Professor James Pethica, the great scholar of Lady Gregory. It's my joy and honor to introduce James. He teaches at Williams College, where he specializes in Irish studies, drama and modernism. He received his BA and DPhil from Oxford University. His many publications include 2 volumes in the Cornell Yeats series, Yeats, a Norton Critical Edition, and Lady Gregory's Diaries, 1892 to 1902. James is a former director of the Yeats International Summer School. He's preparing the authorized biography of Lady Gregory for Oxford University Press. And he's also the director of the Yeats Winter School. And the next session of the Yeats Winter School will take place in January 2022. I believe it's the 20 in Sligo, in person. There will be some online hybrid activity, of course, as with everything. I think from now on, there's a new world. But James tells me it's around the 25th, 24th, 25th. But check that out, please. James, of course, was also the co-curator with Colm Tóibín of the groundbreaking New York Public Library exhibition of Lady Gregory's papers, which are held at the New York Public Library, which opened in March, sadly, 2022. So coinciding with Una's performance there in Lady G in New York. So many of us were there at the opening of this groundbreaking exhibition of Lady Gregory, a solo exhibition of her work at New York Public Library. We were so proud and awe-inspired to walk up the steps of the New York Public Library, those marble steps, and to see Our Lady Gregory's face and being and works all there on the first floor of the New York Public Library. What a wonderful, unforgettable moment. Sadly, of course, everything closed around the world, but that does not detract from the absolute importance of that moment for Lady Gregory and for everything in Irish culture and history to happen in New York City. So enough from me, and I'm handing over it to Professor James Pethica. Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. It's a great pleasure always to be at the gathering, and particularly to see so many dear faces on the screen. And I too are really looking forward to when we can reconvene in person together. Thanks, Marion and Ronnie, for inviting me to speak today yet again. And I hope everybody will lobby Una Clancy to persuade the Irish Repertory Theatre in New York to put on that wonderful production, cut short rudely by the pandemic, but it was really just a vibrant experience, and I hope we will have the chance to see it again. To the forthcoming volume, Lady Gregory's Shorter Writings up to 1900. It's going to be out, I hope, by December. So we'll make a great Christmas present, order early. It includes everything she published that's not been previously collected in those years, and things she prepared for publication, which for one reason or another, they were refused or she decided against, that never made it into print, along with a few other items, personal writings, in manuscript, which really demanded to be included because of their biographical interest or their creative significance. So really very much, to use Una's phrase there from that last clip, grain from the sheaf of papers that she left. Now, those years of Lady Gregory's marriage, 1880 to 1892, are still in many ways the unknown period of her life. And that's because her diaries for those years remain unpublished, as does the lion's share of her correspondence. That I'm hoping to change pretty soon. An edition of selected letters is well on its way. I hope to have that ready by 2024. And those years really so different from, again, what Una referred to, you know, the Lady Gregory, you know, who we think of as being conjured up by Yeats. She consistently referred to her marriage in positive terms. She was very careful about that. And there's just one instance in her later life where, I think in an unguarded moment, she says how wonderful the marriage was, but in creative terms, they were, and these are her words, wasted years. And this volume, it's going to, in tandem with the Early Irish Writings volume, which came out a few years back, show that she wrote a good deal between 1882 and 1896 when she met Yeats, but never consistently and never with a clear focus or clear subject matter, not one that emerges really into view until around 1894, 1895, where she starts discovering, you know, our Ireland as her real subject. So most of what she wrote is responding to particular circumstances, such as the early political writings, her pamphlet on Araby, in response to her support for the Irish, the Egyptian nationalist cause, or they're opportunistic or occasional in some way. And that's not surprising, I think. After all, she spent typically 4 months a year traveling abroad with Sir William. Not time it would have been easy to write. India, Ceylon, all across Europe. She was a mother with a child to look after. When they were in London, she's a society figure and a hostess, all sorts of obligations. And when she's at Coole, there's all those domestic social demands on her time and energy there. So it would have been hard, but she did keep writing all the time, intermittently, but all the time. And this volume shows, I think, above all, the creative drive that's there, the ambition that's there, that haven't yet found their outlet and their focus. Now, I can only give a few highlights with my time here. I'm going to begin, of course, with some of the things that are going to be entirely new to readers of the book. I think seen maybe by just a very, very small group of Gregory scholars, and a few literally seen by Colin Smythe, myself, and a couple other people when I turned in the manuscript. So it might be fun to begin with some items of biographical significance. In the middle 1880s, Lady Gregory wrote a fair number of quite personal poems. Her love sonnets, the sequence of 12 sonnets to Wilfred Score and Blunt, which have been in print for a good number of years, are an obvious example. And I hope many of you know her lyric, Alas, a Woman May Not Love, from 1885, which is in the early Irish Writings. So quite personal poems. But there are quite a few others, and there are a few stray references to them in the literature, but they're not being reprinted. So I'm going to start with one, undated, but almost certainly somewhere between 1884 and 1886. After her affair with Wilfred Score and Blunt ended, she acknowledged to him years afterwards, it's in his diary, I think it's 1912 or 1914, that she recommitted herself to her marriage and that she wanted, her words here, to be a good wife. And this poem suggests, whatever else, that commitment was surprisingly rewarded, at least for a little while. And the poem is, They Told Me Love Was Dead. They told me love was dead, I with another wed. A gracious bridegroom, friendship was he hight, old word meaning called. We walked on side by side, we spoke of him who died, we hid his grave with garlands out of sight. They told me love had risen, burst from his pansied prison. Troubled, I looked in my companion's eyes, but what I therein saw smote me with sudden awe. My new lord was my old lord in disguise. Now, we always have to be careful reading things like this biographically, but it certainly looks as though she returns to Sir William and finds there's much more there. That moment of those months with the affair with Blunt had suggested. There are other poems written for certain during her travels in India, 1885, the winter of 1885, that tell a different story, though. Story of shipboard flirtation, and plenty of disillusionment. And there's another from around the same time, which I'll also read, which I think is important because it shows just this deep yearning for emotional connection. If you could know how sad and sore a life without a hearth or home, I think that sometimes by my door your path would come. If you could know what comfort lies in the mere radiance of a glance, you'd to my windows raise your eyes as if by chance. If you could know what strength and stay one heart is to another heart, you'd on my doorstep sit and play a sister's part. If you could know what now is done, the love that longs your love to win, I think perhaps you'd turn and come quite simply in. The interesting, striking element in that poem is the phrase a sister's part, I think. Is this poem written not to a man, whether that man's real or imagined, but to a woman whose close friendship she wants, someone perhaps to replace the intimacy she'd felt with her sister Gertrude, who died in 1879. Or maybe more interestingly, in our contemporary terms, is it to a man who doesn't have love or sexual desire as his aim, and who could play, the word of the poem, a sister's part? Can't answer that. There's nothing in the archive, and off we can go and speculate, and we have to be careful in doing so. But a revealing poem, however one couches it. For me, the biggest surprise in completing the volume was a very, very late discovery, found, in fact, a week before I turned the manuscript in for printing. It was something I'd spent a couple of weeks, very arduous weeks, looking for 20 years earlier, literally turning page after page, day after day in the Colindale newspaper library in London. And I gave up. I looked again a decade later, couldn't find it, and figured this must have been printed anonymously. I didn't even know what it was, a poem, a story, an article, a review, couldn't say. I gave it one last shot before turning the manuscript in, and to my delight, it's a short story, never seen before, published in 1890. I was chastened to discover that it had been in plain view where I ought to have known it should be all along, and I somehow missed it. I really can't think there'll be many more finds like this this early in Lady Gregory's career, so that was really very exciting. It's set in Italy, and draws on her experiences there during her travels in the late 1870s with her invalid brother Richard, and the opening sequence draws on things that we have in her An Emigrant's Notebook. And I'll just say this: you have to wait for the book. No spoilers. It's a hidden secret mystery, and really very well crafted. So there are 5 short stories we now know of, 4 written in 1890. Really a quite remarkable output for that year, and there she is, looking for that ambition, that drive, looking for something to coalesce around. And then the one later story, Dies Irae, which is going to be in this volume, written in 1894. And those 5 are enough to suggest she could have had a good minor career as a fiction writer. So a real surprise. Okay, then to some other things in the volume. Let me skip over here. I have everything in the wrong order, typically. Never mind. The lion's share the writings in this volume that were published are, I should stress, listed in Colin Smythe's checklist in Lady Gregory 50 Years After. Most of them, you know, they're accessible. Some of them are hard to find. There's travel writings like her essay Through Portugal and Glimpses of the Sudan, published in the Fortnightly Review. There are political writings like Araby, which I've already mentioned. But it's maybe the things that are not included in that checklist which are going to provide the bigger surprises. There's a pamphlet that she issued in 1887 to raise money for a poor parish in London, St. Stephen's, Southwark. And then she reissued a revised version in 1891, Over the River, it's titled, and it's really quite wonderful, full of small sociological detail. She's going into the houses of really very poor people and generating these vignettes of what their life is like and reporting exactly what they say using direct speech. So very much anticipates what she goes on to do 6, 7, or 8 years later as a folklore gatherer. And it certainly anticipates acumen, acuity in mobilizing her social networks to raise money, as she goes on to do with the Irish Literary Theatre in 1897. Again, I think that most readers are going to find the never published writings the most interesting. So particularly those that start to focus on Irish subjects. So I'll mention just a couple of those. And if I could share screen right now, let's go for this. No, I'm disabled. Could I be enabled for screen sharing? Ronnie or Marion, if you can hear me. I don't seem to be able to share screen. Or Ben. Silence this end.
Ben, Ronnie, or
you're host actually, aren't you, Melissa? In which case you could share.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. One participant can share at a time.
Okay. Oh, it says I'm co-host now. Okay, that should do it.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. We're looking here at an item from the New York Public Library, a short catechism on the financial claims of Ireland. And you can see probably in the top right-hand corner, by Lady Gregory, and top left-hand corner proof. And it's rather beaten up. And it's from 1898, corrected galleys. This is a heavily political item that she wrote. During a period right after 1897, where there's constant parliamentary debate and pressure from Irish nationalist MPs for reparations to correct the overweighted taxation on Ireland. And there are committees set up, and it drags on for years, and the British government, of course, avoids action as much as they can. In this pamphlet, Lady Gregory keeps her focus remorselessly on the question of money and on the history of the hearings and what the Royal Commission has done and failed to do. But there are these revealing moments that show the massive nationalist inflection towards the end of the essay. And I'll pick out just a couple of moments here to read to you. Question. It's all done as a catechism, question and answer. Question. How has Ireland been already acknowledged as a national entity? Answer. By separate legislation as to land, police, education, and local government, by the disestablishment of the church, by the presence of a viceroy, and in 1896, by the Tory government when the Agricultural Rating Bill was passed. So her aim here is to make the case Ireland is already an independent nation. You've got to act here. Question. What are the causes of relative poverty in Ireland? Answer. 2 may be mentioned which are due to nature and 1 due to man. The excessive rainfall is against successful agriculture. The lack of coal, iron, and other profitable minerals is against the success in manufactures. And the trade and industries that, in spite of these drawbacks, had grown up in the last 2 centuries, were willfully destroyed by England and had never recovered from the successive blows that fell upon them. And here's the payoff. Question: with what object was Irish trade destroyed? Answer: with that of satisfying the commercial jealousy of English merchants. And there she is, right? I love some of the body English I'm seeing on the screen. Lady Gregory lands a blow right on the chin. It's unclear if this was ever actually printed or distributed. I've never found any copies, but either way, it's clearly a milestone work, you know, as deliberate political involvement maybe as she ever made. And shows that emerging nationalism, along with things like the essay, The Felons of Our Land, which has been reprinted and appears again in this volume. All right, the writings of 1897 to 1900, she's met Yeats. Those tell us much more about her emergence as a folklore gatherer, about her commitment to the Gaelic League and her early efforts to learn Irish, about her involvement in the theatre movement, at this point only as an organizer and as a fundraiser, not as a writer. And I think the most important item from this period is her essay, Ireland, Real and Ideal, published in the 19th century in 1898, not been reprinted. It's an absolutely wonderful essay. And I think, for me, captures the pivot point in her career, this moment where she starts to commit and knows she's found her subject. The fact that it's published in the 19th century, which was absolutely the establishment journal in Britain, you know, the equivalent of the Times newspaper. That says something because almost everything she published prior to that year, she publishes in some Irish journal or newspaper, and most of those are published anonymously. The reason being she wasn't ready to show to her British social circle and friends that she's crossing over and committing to Irishness. So the essay shows her weighing what she's going to do next, how she's going to commit. Is it to Ireland Real? Is it Ireland Ideal? And that divide, it's one that absorbs her for the rest of her career. Una, you know, highlighted the service. You know, what can I do to help the country? What can I do to help activists in all the spheres that are helping build the country? So the essay starts out praising Horace Plunkett and the Irish Agricultural Organisation Society, setting up collectives, cooperative dairies, actively helping rural agricultural, rural workers. And then in the second portion of the essay, she turns to the ideal, which is cultural activism. How do we use literature and other forms to build the country? And there she starts praising Douglas Hyde, the founder of the Gaelic League, and that idea that through reviving and promoting the Irish language, we can stress a singular, a unique Irish heritage, right? This is what holds us together. And she says, you know, the question is who can express the spirituality, the individuality of Irishness. And she starts with Douglas Hyde's translations of folk songs, which she clearly loved and which she tried to emulate herself with her own translations, of course. But the essay ends alluding to Yeats, and you can see her weighing the force, the attraction, the likely achievement of these two powerful, influential men. Who's she going to give her fullest allegiance to? She cared about them both. In another essay written a year after Ireland Real and Ideal, she uses religious language to talk about Hyde and Yeats. And with Lady Gregory, that's always revealing when she talks in religious terms, and her own personal faith is coming out, her commitment is coming out. And she calls Hyde the apostle of the Irish language, powerful term. But then she goes on and refers to Yeats as a poet preacher. And you know then, when you read that phrase, she's made the essential choice. It's Yeats. That's where her principal energies are going to go. He's the Shelleyan. He's the true visionary, the one who's going to do the most. All right, I'm running out of time. The volume ends with a last publication in December 1900. And I think the volume ends in exactly the right place, year-wise. At that point, she's editing, has just finished editing Ideals in Ireland, which I hope you all know, a collection of essays by Yeats and Hyde, George Moore and John Eglinton and others. And she's the editor. It comes out in February 1901. And in taking on that editorial role, she's taking a frontal role, right? Asserting herself as a critic, as a cultural activist. And the last item in the volume, she gives Standish O'Grady, who was the editor of All Ireland Review, she gives him, her term, a scolding, because he's taken Yeats to task with something he said in the essay he's going to include. And I think, again, that's sort of absolutely a transitional moment. She's got this new confidence. She can hit back, say what she thinks far more directly, insert herself at the center of events. And the reasons for that, I think, are very clear. I'll read from her diary from November of 1900. I've had an idea floating in my mind for some time that I might put together the Irish legends into a sort of Morte d'Arthur, choosing only the most beautiful or striking. I think of putting each story into the Irish idiom of the original. I consulted Yeats, and after a short hesitation, he said he thinks the idea very good. So I'll try and carry it out. And I'm provided with work for the rest of my life. Well, as we know, it took her about 10 months to finish the book, and off she moves, devouring all before her. But it's that sense. She's found what she needs. She can now write. She can now create. And of course, Yeats, when she meets him in London in February 1901, she records at the time, he says that I must go on and it will be a great book. And later, in 70 years, she said, that's the moment he came to look upon me as a fellow writer. And that's it. She's launched into the later career that we all know. And 1901, she starts collaborating with Yeats more directly on plays, Kathleen O'Houlihan that autumn, and onto her own plays by the end of 1901. The rest, as I say, is history. So I hope you'll enjoy the volume. The second volume will cover 1901 to 1932 and add to the record of that better known territory, but there's going to be some real surprises in that volume too. And it's going to be pretty hot on the heels of the first volume. I'm close to being able to say it will be ready by December 2022, so a year after this one. So stay tuned on that. Okay, thank you so much. Pleasure to be with you, and I'll look forward to the Q&A, and very much hope there'll be a chance to talk with many of you individually as well. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much, James. It's safe to say that we are counting the minutes, nay seconds, until we can get our hands on these volumes. You have brought Lady Gregory alive in such a beautiful way alongside Una. We're hearing the woman come, you've brought her alive for us in so many new ways. As a woman, as a wife, as a writer, you've put so much in those 15, 20 minutes. It's extraordinarily rich. We think about Lady Gregory, real and ideal. That's what's coming out here. We're thinking about her and how, if we compare it to Una, we're seeing that embodiment on the stage in performance, and we're seeing her embodied through your meticulous bringing to life of the woman and her work again. So thank you so much. It is, again, goosebumps in a different way, but beautifully complementing Una. Luminous and exciting. Thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Barry Houlihan. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Barry Houlihan to you. He is, who many of you will know, an archivist at the National University of Ireland, Galway. Barry lectures in theatre history and digital cultures. His recent book has just been published, Theatre and Archival Memory, Irish Drama and Marginalised Histories from 1951 to 1977. And it is no understatement to say that this is a groundbreaking contribution to Irish theatre history. I have read every word of this book, and it is absolutely outstanding for so many reasons. In terms of its archival, never known before information, just as we hear from James, that attention to going to the archive and bringing it alive again for all of us. And also for Barry's wonderful inclusion of the brilliant Lelia Doolan, who is here with us this evening, and how he includes Lelia's contribution and outstanding work in Irish theatre and culture. So that really comes through in Barry's book as well. So I urge you all to read it, and it's wonderful to see Lelia here, and I just wish I could give you all a hug. But enough from me. I'm just handing over. Barry, as you will all know, contributes regularly to RTE Brainstorm on topics of theatre, literature, culture and archival heritage, and he's going to talk to us now very excitingly about plans for the 90th anniversary of Lady Gregory in 2022, as well as remembering Gregory through the decades. So I'm going to hand over to Barry now. Thank you.
Great. Good evening, everyone, and Melissa, thank you so much for all overly kind and overly generous words of introduction. It's a real pleasure to join in as part of this annual Gregory gathering this autumn online. My thanks to Mary and to Ronnie, and indeed to everyone, and indeed to all great co-panelists this evening. So I'm going to just try and share my screen with you. Okay, so hopefully all is coming up on screen as we speak. There we go. So hopefully all can see that. And what I wanted to talk about this evening is indeed perhaps looking forward to next year, the 90th anniversary, and perhaps cheekily I could ask at the Q&A, maybe we could all bring some thoughts and opinions there as to how we can do that. How do we begin commemorating or thinking about the 90th anniversary of Gregory? I want to maybe go back a bit before that and think about how Gregory has been remembered over the years, or not in some instances. And again, by trawling the collections that we have, and we're very fortunate to have at NUI Galway, in collections like the Abbey Theatre Digital Archive, or a great collection that is with us via Colin Smythe. And with this image on screen, I found last year trawling some online archives, and it's from the Chicago Daily News in 1912. And it's from a part of the significant Abbey Theatre tour to the United States in 1911, 1912. And of course, which Gregory was a major part of. And the image symbolizes, I think, a great deal about how we can begin to look at Gregory's legacy. And here she is in perhaps a pose that I haven't seen in too many other photographs in many other collections. Yes, she's still in the black mourning clothes, which have become part of her identity almost. But if we look beyond that and look behind the veil that's in many of the portraits that we're more familiar with, this image of action, this woman of vigor, of writing, at work at the mechanics of the typewriter. And I think it's a really beautiful shot that has the through section through the cogs and gears of the typewriter. Those mechanics that make Gregory's thoughts become real on the page and become manifest on the stage and in other means. And it's just fascinating to hear all James's work, trawling those papers at the Bird collection at the NYPL as well, and what real treasures are still coming to light. So this image from Chicago, Gregory was in Chicago with a group called the Hull House Players at the time, a working class cooperative, which again shows how Gregory was so interested in all these different diverse voices and backgrounds and societies, producing theatre in different forms, and how she was the headline news. And again, as the photo on screen shows her at work, it also shows her with a resolute pose on her look on her face, annoyed at her work being disturbed by the photographer who rushed to the hotel in Chicago to meet her. So she was a headline news story in the United States. And in particular, I look at, again, some other archival evidence for that to show you how Gregory was being archived or being memorialized in real time by those around her, particularly in places like the United States, where she was seen as such a significant figure. Looking ahead, of course, then to the anniversary next year, I mean, we don't need anniversaries in some ways, particularly with Gregory. We don't need it to be a 90th anniversary to engage with the legacy and engage again with the performance records and the biographical records and see where we can find new traces of networks and of intricacies of her work. But one of the first points I wanted to share are from those wonderful essays that she wrote, and which James has given us some extras from already. On a trip to the Berg Library recently, one essay I was reading in her own manuscript was from Ireland and Worlds Unseen, written around this time this photograph was taken. The essay is from 1914. And in that, Gregory writes that all countries should have their own Old Testament, the foundation on which newer revelations should be built. Ireland is but a borrower of that universal possession. She has not the complete mythologies of the Greeks or of the philosophic systems of the East. What is left of her early mythology is in fragments, in complexity, but what we can claim is a continuity of vision, a continuity that has never been broken. So again, these wonderful words and these wonderful insights of Gregory, again, the influences of the Greeks and of the early classical drama. And she talks about Ireland's early mythology in fragments. And it's these fragments, these stories through the archives, I'm keen to try and knit back together in some ways through what we hold here at Inuit Galway. And in some of those networks of the material legacies, the connections she had at the Abbey Theatre, I was drawn to the archive of Arthur Shields, Abbey actor, stage manager for a good number of years at the Abbey, and of course an actor in many of Gregory's plays. Shields was also involved in the 1916 Rising as a 19-year-old and starred in many of the first productions of Gregory's plays, but later on he would star as one of the policemen in The Rising of the Moon, staged at the Abbey in March 1916. This was his last performance, and indeed one of the last performances at all at the Abbey Theatre before The Rising took place the following month. But this performance again was Arthur's last physical role before he would performatively take to the streets as a member of the volunteers reporting at Liberty Hall under James Connolly. But one wonders that the closing lines of the play, the last words he would have heard on the Abbey stage, as said by the beggarman in The Rising of the Moon, "Maybe I could do the same for you when the small rise up and the big fall down at the rising of the moon," perhaps may have lingered on Shields' mind as the rising broke out, and as he scrambled under the Abbey stage to retrieve his rifle from where it was hidden, before again he reported under James Connolly. Within Shields' archive with us here at Inuit Galway is a handwritten account of his career with the Abbey Theatre. And it's a remarkable account as an account of his years as an actor, a stage manager, but many other roles of administration that he undertook in his time. But it also, interestingly, includes memories and an archive of his direct accounts of his experiences working with Gregory. And in that one of those accounts, he writes that Gregory was a wonderful woman. Every play in my time was read by her. She was very helpful, and as you will gather from his autobiographies to O'Casey in his early days. She never liked me, however, but that did not matter. She was a great person. So regardless if that's true or not, whether she cared for Shields or not, and I think in other letters he was, I think, slightly intimidated by her and her presence and her role and all that came with her at the Abbey. I think whether she cared for him or not, she certainly left a mark on him. And Shields admired Gregory a great deal, and that's clear from the letters and the papers within his collection. Famously, of course, or before I get to this in a second, he played opposite her. Some excerpts here from his library collection, these wonderful first editions that we have. And for the collection of Inuit Galway to have any first editions of Gregory's works, it's really thanks to Shields. Also, Smythe's collection is wonderful. But we see the impact that she had on him by virtue of what he collected. Now, not just the amount of work he collected of her published works, but also the affection which she had for him through the annotations and through the inscriptions in the many, many volumes. And this one volume itself brings together so many key figures of the revival and of the Abbey Theatre. So we see not just Gregory's inscription to Arthur Shields on the inside cover of her own book, but the bookplate is designed by Micheál Mac Liammóir, and indeed a perhaps underappreciated great visual artist of his own right. But in the volume links the Gay Theatre, the Abbey Theatre, Gregory, Mac Liammóir, and Shields. And as an object, it's a truly remarkable piece of Irish theatre heritage. And of course, passing through Gregory's hands on its way to Shields. Likewise with this edition of MacDonough's Wife, which Gregory inscribed here to Barry Fitzgerald with best wishes, Augusta Gregory. This is, of course, Barry Fitzgerald or Willie Shields, Arthur's brother. So it's really the Shields family library, and many of the editions are shared between the brothers in the library collection that came to us. But this is the image, of course, the famous image. And I believe this was also featured in the All This Mine Alone exhibition at the New York Public Library last year, which was so wonderfully curated by James and by Colm Tobin. Again, this copy from Arthur's own papers. And when you knit all these different networks together, you see the figure that Gregory cast on not just the Abbey as an institution, but on the actors. And I think Arthur, as a great comic actor, and indeed as his brother Barry was as well, to trace those performance histories of Gregory's plays and who was in them, and particularly Arthur as a key figure there, will show up, perhaps looking towards commemorations next year, some new insights. And indeed, as Arthur described her, a wonderful woman, and someone I think that left a legacy on him, and it's carried through his library and through his archive. But thinking then about other examples of these sites of memory, the archives and the collections, the library collections, and thinking about The Rising of the Moon once more, a play which Arthur talked about and of course starred in. In her journals, Gregory talked about a meeting with the Irish language activist and writer Tomás Ó Concannon at Coole Park as a possible place, again, as a memory, as a piece of inspiration for the writing of The Rising of the Moon. Now, Ó Concannon was passing through Coole Park when his bicycle suffered a breakdown and needed repair. And he was invited to stay at Coole, where two local policemen fixed the bicycle. But that Ó Concannon, as an Irish language activist and as a member of the Gaelic League, sensed he was getting a welcome, perhaps through nationalist sensibilities within the uniformed policemen. Later on, Gregory also noted that when she was a child and as she was crossing the river where today Salmon Weir Bridge faces the cathedral, but was the imposing site of Galway jail, that she could see the men imprisoned through the bars of the jail windows. And again, to quote from her journals, "I used to wonder if ever a prisoner might by some means climb the high buttress wall and slip away into the darkness by the canal to the quays and find friends to hide him under a load of kelp in a fishing boat, as happens to my ballad singing man." The play was considered offensive to those extreme nationalists before it was acted because it showed the police in too favourable a light. So all these Galway sites and Galway memories held by Gregory are peppered through her plays, from Galway to Coole to the surrounding areas. They all are sites of memory. And again, they are the environment which Gregory would then populate on the stage and fill with the characters and the dialogue that we are now so familiar with and love so dearly. But again, within the Abbey Theatre Digital Archive here at Uni Galway, where many of the original records of the Abbey productions and of the staging and design of Gregory's plays are, we can interrogate and see these plays in their first settings, in their first productions, and how we can be more familiar with perhaps Gregory's own sites of memory within the productions. And sorry, just before that, I should say that, actually that's in this, I'll come back to that. It's in the wrong order. This is what I was looking for, which is spreading the news. And again, this is something that we don't always get in the text, you know, is that landscape, the visuality of the place and surroundings of Gregory's plays. And this is part of the great achievements of the Irish Reps wonderful productions, which Una talked about so well, and indeed with Druid Gregory's productions last year, is to put the works back up on their staging and let us into the worlds that Gregory created. So from a few more examples within the Abbey Theatre Archive, we see the 1927 production of Sancho's Master. In production of the same year, of 1927 at the Abbey, the interior site of the house from the play Dave, and again Aristotle's Bellows in 1921. So all these original shots from the Abbey Theatre are Gregory's plays forming into the canon and forming into a part of archival memory. Okay, so just to go back through these and regain my order, it's on this question of legacy. And again, this ties into commemoration and yet looking towards next year as well. But before we go into 2022 and the 90th anniversary, let's go back 90 years to 1932 and the passing, of course, of Lady Gregory. And on the death of Gregory in May 1932, playwright and board member of the Abbey Theatre, Lennox Robinson, described Gregory in the Irish Press newspaper as an internationalist, the most distinguished woman dramatist in the world today. And Robinson, in that same interview for the Irish Press newspaper, called on the Irish government to fully recognise and to pay tribute to Gregory's achievements, to which she gave so freely, and again to quote, and as he described, which she gave for Ireland. But as we know, that recognition was all not too forthcoming, with the House and Gardens passing into state ownership in 1927 and soon after falling into ruin. The records and archives then that document Gregory's administrative legacy as part of the Abbey Theatre board minutes show the non-commemoration and the non-recognition of Gregory, and as forewarned by Lennox Robinson himself, that within the board minutes, which we've digitized and made freely available online, we see Gregory in the final months before her death still sharing minutes of the board of the Abbey Theatre. And the last AGM, the last annual general meeting that Gregory chaired, was as late as the 17th of June, 1931. And of course, within a year, she will have passed. But there is little evidence in any of the minute books, any evidence at all, in fact, of any official marking of Gregory's passing within the Abbey's board minutes. With no reference to her being recorded until the 19th of May, 1933, a full year afterwards, where it was noted that, and I quote, "A copy of the portrait of Lady Gregory should be obtained for the theatre," and little more than that. Now, presumably, and perhaps that this is the portrait on screen here, the portrait that was painted by Gerard Festus Kelly, dated in 1912, and which is on display at the Abbey Theatre today. Now, the copy is what is in the Abbey Theatre of this painting. The original is what hangs, thankfully and very proudly, in our archives reading room at NUI Galway, since the university acquired the painting in 2015. So thinking forward again to beyond the landscape, or beyond the non-recognition of Gregory within her own lifetime, which is curious to see within the Abbey Theatre minute books. It's something that didn't quite subside in the years that followed, and the production histories bear this out. When we go through the production records of later productions of Gregory plays, as recently as 1990, and as part of the annual W.B. Yeats International Theatre Festival, Kathleen O'Houlihan was programmed, and on screen you can see the program here as part of 3 plays by W.B. Yeats. There is no mention of Gregory anywhere throughout the program as being associated with the play, not to mention even being credited as a co-author. So as late as 1990, of course, the Abbey Theatre is still presenting these records as being, or this production as being, a Yeats play. So to really put into context that impact that Gregory had, going back to some of the American tours of the early 20th century, by the 1911 tour, Gregory, he received a press cutting of the Abbey players arriving in the United States in 1911. But it's Gregory the press come to meet. She is the headline news. She is the story. The front page of Boston America tells us with a large front page photograph that Lady Gregory arrives today. And again, all the subline headings is Lady Gregory is in Boston. Before, as Yeats was speaking to other groups around the city, the press of Boston's media chose to come to Gregory. The Boston Globe does no different. Again, here, the front page story is Lady Augusta Gregory, I'm an Irish dramatist, and Alfred Tennyson, Dickens, son of the great author, arrived, but yet Gregory gets the greatest plaudits here. Now, she's the one the media seek out throughout a lot of the tour, and Paige Reynolds' article goes into great detail about the celebrity of Lady Gregory in the United States. As is in Washington, in Providence, Rhode Island, where this production took place, there was 30 policemen waiting for outside the theatre for fear anything would take off during the production of the Playboy. As it says in the subheadline, nothing doing, however, but yet it's Gregory who tells and talks of Irish drama. And she is the representation of Irish drama in the United States. But this other wonderful image that comes from another Boston newspaper, a new literary movement has turned Irish imagination from politics to drama. And here Lady Gregory is called the ministering angel of the Irish players. So it's to come forward full circle then into where we were last year. And despite everything that happened, despite the pandemic closing all too soon, the most wonderful exhibition at the NYPL and the wonderful productions at the Irish Rep, 2020 was still perhaps the year of Gregory. So even though we had at least the plays happen at Irish Rep and we had at least the exhibition open at the NYPL, though close all too soon, Druid Gregory came about, opening at Coole Park before touring to a number of venues around the west of Ireland, and of course directed by Gary Hines. So as Una talked about earlier, what I think these plays succeeded in so well was about presenting Gregory as both a historical figure of cultural importance, but the playwright, and to give us the plays back on stage to see them happening again, and indeed perhaps interpret her own memory of them. So these all become, again, as I say, sites of memory as the young Gregory walked past Galway jail and imagining someone springing a jailbreak and becoming the inspiration for the rising of the moon. So too was Coole Park, perhaps obviously the greatest site of memory for Hines's production. But it didn't go into any sort of hagiography. It wasn't about becoming a lament for Gregory. It was, I think, a very objective and I think successful presentation of the figure of Gregory, who ghosted around the park itself while never becoming an overbearing presence, but yet was present through the set designs, particularly through the lighting, which was so wonderfully done by Francis O'Connor. And as you can see on screen, and even though the site, the house is obviously this great void within Coole Park, the plinth represents its footprint. And it wasn't about recreating the house, it wasn't about recreating Gregory, it was about letting the place stand. And what Francis O'Connor's design succeeded in, perhaps most of all, was just by its simple focus on windows and doors, these portals and portents through the community and through the worlds that Gregory created on stage, back out through Coole Park, allowing us to see the landscape around it, as if we could be in the house itself. So Hyacinth Halvey, of course, played part of that. And again, it's the lighting, that simple beam lighting of the windows and doors, creating the village where the butcher shop and the post office stood, and so famously and so humorously presented in Hyacinth Halvey. And as Lady Gregory herself became personified as Kathleen O'Houlihan, so memorably by Marie Mullen, we are reminded of the sense of cloaking, and she's wearing the black cloak there. And it's again about uncovering the sense of Lady Gregory's legacy as we can move towards a remembrance next year. So just before I finish up, I'm going to play a clip here of a poem which was part of the Druid Gregory commissions, alongside the wonderful series of poems that Gary Hines produced and directed with Druid. A really beautiful accompaniment was a number of poems read by leading Irish writers, contemporary Irish writers. And one of those is Doireann na Gríofa. And na Gríofa is, of course, the author of the recent novel, or a recent book, A Ghost in the Throat, a beautiful book. And here she reads The Heart of the Wood. And in particular, it's a very short piece, it's only a minute long. And not just great to hear na Gríofa reading it, but to listen to her description of the language, the cloaking of the Irish, of the translation of Irish upon English. And I'll play this clip and then we'll conclude afterwards.
There's a phrase in the Irish language, Chur mé béarla air. I put English on it that I find very striking when I'm translating. It's almost, or what it brings to mind to me is the sense of cloaking a language in another language, in a dominant language in this case. And so this sé seo an béarla a chur Lady Gregory ar an dáin seo, this is the English that Lady Gregory has put on this lost poem. The Heart of the Wood. My hope and my love, we will go for a while into the wood, scattering the dew, where we will see the trout. We will see the blackbird in its nest, the deer and the buck calling, the little bird on the highest branch that sings the sweetest, the cuckoo up on the fresh green, and death will never come near us in the sweet wood.
Okay, a really, really beautiful, I think, tribute to Gregory. And again, the poetry was always recited in the site, in the location that accompanied the productions. So finish up, the thing forward, again, this image on screen here is from the exhibition, from the great privilege it was to have been there, and again to see you, and a great privilege to see Una and the great cast of the Irish of the Irish Rep. To think about moving forward, to bring this exhibition to Coole or to Galway, or part of it at least, would be remarkable. Again, hopefully we could bring some materials from the NUIG collections, both physically and digitally, to life once more, and create perhaps a new record of those connections, of those networks, from people like Arthur Shields, who called her that wonderful woman, and who starred in so many of her works. And to see those legacies, the material legacies, her writings and the inscriptions of those volumes, position her within that revival period of the Abbey Theatre and everything else around it. To build a new archive or build a new legacy for Gregory is perhaps something those works instigated last year from the Irish Rep and from Druid, to uncloak the legacy of Gregory as Ní Ghríofa, to uncloak the language and uncloak the person behind it, and to perhaps present her works for new audiences and to keep the work alive going forward. If we can do that, I think in the archive we can achieve a lot. And I do look forward to next year and see what indeed we can do to celebrate and mark Gregory's 90th anniversary. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barry. That was an extraordinary uncloaking of your own there. As you say, to borrow Ní Ghríofa's metaphor, very beautiful. And I think we'll agree that all three speakers today have shone a new light on this writer that we love so much. The opening photo that you showed us, Barry, it's extraordinary. And you showed me that a while ago. We're so used to seeing Lady Gregory, Augusta Lady Gregory, in profile, distanced, removed from us with a title, Lady. There's always, there's historically been a sense that she's unattainable to us. And what I'm really feeling tonight is a sense of intimacy in the embodiment that Una brings, that luminosity in the closeness of the looking at her as a writer and her history with James, and you here too, Barry, with your attention to her life and work. But that photo is extraordinary, and I'm going to be quiet here but in a moment, but it's that sense of intimacy with the way she's looking at us directly, that direct look that we get from Una, the direct look we get through James's work, the direct look we get through you, but just to be able to see her looking us in the eye, that's the new thing now. That's what's really coming through from the year of 2020, is how she now is looking us in the eye again. It's an extraordinary moment to see how 2020 was her year, and it's going to keep going. There's a new confidence and directness in her relationship with us. She is not some ghosted, haunted history from the margins now. She's asserting herself very strongly, as I can feel tonight. So thank you, Barry. And our next speaker, our final speaker, is, I'm delighted to announce to you, is
I can hear her.
Sir Christopher Frayling. I hope you can all hear me now. So I'm thrilled to introduce Sir Frayling. He was formerly rector of the Royal College of Art, London, the only wholly postgraduate university of art and design in the world. He was chair of the Arts Council of England and of the British Design Council, and the longest serving trustee of the V&A Museum. For 10 years, he has also chaired the Royal Mint Design Committee, advising on the design of the coinage. An historian, a writer, an exhibitions curator, and an award-winning broadcaster on television and radio, he has published widely on art, design, and popular culture. His latest books include Once Upon a Time in the West, Shooting a Masterpiece, Craftsmanship Towards a New Bauhaus, and Inside the Bloody Chamber, essays on Angela Carter and the Gothic. His latest, The Hollywood History of Art, is to be published in spring 2022. In 2000, Christopher was knighted in Buckingham Palace for services to art and design education. He is currently Professor Emeritus of Cultural History at the RCA, Distinguished Visiting Professor at the University of Lancaster, a Fellow at the V&A, and Chancellor of the Arts University, Bournemouth. He has been spending several months a year in Kinvara, County Galway, with his wife, the painter Helen Frayling, ever since the 1970s. And he writes his books there. And in Who's Who, he lists as his main hobby, finding time, which I think is intriguing. And we could all do with doing more of that. So it's my honor to introduce Sir Christopher Frayling.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to join this year's Lady Gregory gathering. Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you, Marion. Because actually the seeds of my presentation were sown at an earlier gathering in September 2018, when James Pethiker talked about the rebel songs and ballads which Lady Gregory read in her youth and enjoyed.
And when on the last morning, Lelia Doolan introduced a film about the Abbey Theatre, its actors and its writers in the 1950s, and you combine that with my own researches into John Ford and American film, and the seeds were sown. So here goes, John Ford and Lady Gregory. In autumn 1963, two young film producers, Robert D. Graff and Robert Emmett Jr., approached the 70-year-old John Ford in Los Angeles with a proposition. They'd commissioned the British playwright John Whiting to write a screenplay based on the middle two volumes of Sean O'Casey's creative autobiography, Drums Under the Window and Inish Fallen, Fare Thee Well, starting the story with the general strike in Dublin, October 1913, and finishing it with the noisy opening performances of The Plough and the Stars at the Abbey Theatre in February 1926, turning O'Casey in between times into an angry young man, fighter, lover, rebel, as the posters were to say, but mainly lover. The young producers knew that O'Casey had had an up and down relationship with John Ford, to say the least. He turned down the opportunity to write the script of The Informer in 1935, and he disliked Ford's film version of The Plough and the Stars in 1936 so much that it had put him off agreeing to any further film versions of his work. That and Alfred Hitchcock's equally disastrous film version of Juno and the Paycock in 1930. John Ford's version of The Plough and the Stars, which was a stagey pageant of a film, included film footage of 1919 to 21 to illustrate 1916, and had finished with Preston Foster as Jack, saying to Barbara Stanwyck as Nora, as he looks emotionally upward at the tricolour flag, "We'll live to see Ireland free." A mid-1930s Hollywood ending, if ever there was one, completely at odds with the point of the play. In O'Casey's original, of course, Jack is dead by now, and Nora has lost her mind. So Sean O'Casey was not pleased. But Graff and Jinner had managed to rebuild the playwright's confidence over the years. Robert Jinner had produced a photo essay for Life magazine, The World of Sean O'Casey, way back in 1953. And in 1956, he teamed up with Robert Graff, then a TV producer, to make a television interview called A Conversation with Sean O'Casey. As a result, the playwright had personally approved all the various drafts of John Whiting's screenplay and encouraged the producers to proceed with Young Cassidy, as it was called, after one of the names he adopted before becoming a professional playwright and settling on O'Casey. Cassidy, as in Hopalong, which might or might not help with the marketing of the film. At least one preview journalist thought it was going to be a Western. Sean O'Casey's very last published interview, given a few days before his death in September 1964, while Young Cassidy was still in production, his last interview was actually about the film. If the screenplay had been about the whole of his life, he said, it would have run to over 500,000 words. But John Whiting had done pretty well distilling and streamlining his life story and making sense of it. There was no Gaelic League, no Jim Larkin, and his love interests had been very heavily fictionalized. But he went on, and I quote, "The film shows young Cassidy, actually it was young Cassid in my work, growing up from boyhood in Dublin the way I did. Why did I write young Cassid in the third person? I just did, that's all. An American fella is going to play the part. You have to keep up with the times, you see." Graff and Jinner were convinced that John Ford was the man for the job. After all, he'd made The Informer in 1935, The Quiet Man in 1952, and The Rising of the Moon, which we'll talk about later, in 1957, among many other silent and sound films on Irish and Irish-related themes. As a first-generation immigrant to the USA, he had a strong romantic image of himself as an Irish rebel and was known to admire Sean O'Casey as a worker playwright. John Ford had even included the Bold Fenian Men, his all-time favorite Irish song, on the soundtrack of his Western Rio Grande, a song written in 1916 in a film set in 1879. He loved it that much. Ford was still filming his widescreen epic Cheyenne Autumn at the time, and it was not going well. So he was grumpy. Although O'Casey thought that an American fella would be playing Johnny Cassidy, The first names they discussed were Peter O'Toole, Richard Burton, and Richard Harris. Eileen O'Casey had suggested Tom Courtenay, fresh from the loneliness of the long-distance runner, who certainly resembled the playwright physically. But in the end, they settled on Sean Connery, who was approached and agreed, but who unfortunately had to withdraw because he was contracted to play James Bond in Goldfinger. He was replaced late in the day by the Australian Rod Taylor, to be coached in how to speak a sort of Irish accent by the actor Jack McGowran. But who would play Lady Augusta Gregory? Their thoughts turned to another Augusta, the most famous Augusta in theatrical history, in fact, Lady Bracknell in The Importance of Being Earnest, and in particular to the actress who'd become indelibly associated with the part, much to her annoyance, since first she played it on the West End stage in 1939 and on Broadway in 1947, Dame Edith Evans. In Earnest, she'd been famously haughty, arrogant, a titled lady who rather overdoes both the title and the way she dresses. And that was how she decided to play the part, because she in fact based her performance on the high-handed aristocratic ladies she had served when she was an apprentice milliner in 1903 at the age of 15, and the memory stuck. In Young Cassidy, she was to be cast as a much more nuanced kind of Augusta. Ascendancy on the surface, a bit of a rebel within. Controlled on the outside, passionate inside. Protestant dowager, Abbey Theatre director. A grand motherly figure who enjoyed a good laugh. And a champion, above all, of the arts and artists. A very different sort of Augusta, one who was even in two minds about her own name, just as she wasn't very happy to be lumped with Queen Victoria as a personality type, number 24, in Yeats's A Vision of 1925. There was something almost burlesque about that name, Augusta, the feminine of Emperor Augustus, a majestic, grand, upper-class name, much loved by European royal families and introduced to Britain by King George III. Augusta, as in the dotty Aunt Augusta in P.G. Woodhouse's Jeeves and Wooster stories, or as in the dotty Aunt Augusta in the Just William stories, or Harry Potter, anyone? Or as in Oscar Wilde's Lady Bracknell. Director Anthony Asquith filmed Edith Evans's performance in 1952 and captured not just her voice, but the character of someone who's trying to, just a bit too hard, to be haughty. Here she is interrogating Jack Worthing, played by Michael Redgrave, about his intentions towards her daughter Gwendolen in Algernon's apartment in Half Moon Street. Incidentally, Redgrave was later to be cast as W.B. Yeats in Young Cassidy. So let's have the first clip, please. Edith Evans as Lady Bracknell in the 1952 film of The Importance of Being Earnest.
Now to minor matters. Are your parents living?
I have lost both my parents.
To lose one parent, Mr. Worthing, may be regarded as a misfortune.
Footnote, when I was on the Arts Council of England, I remember we discussed at one meeting the name of a new theatre, which is to open in the town of Bracknell, Berkshire, near Windsor in May 1984. And we decided that the Wild Theatre would be a good idea. And so it has remained in honor of that performance and of the immortal Lady Bracknell. The young producers visiting LA also discussed locations with John Ford, and in April and May 1964, after assembling a rough cut of Cheyenne Autumn, Ford flew over to Dublin via London for 2 pre-production visits. He'd agreed to direct the film for a fee of $50,000, well below his usual, plus a percentage of the profits. And they decided that Coole Park House would be represented by 3 separate locations, all of them in striking distance of the production headquarters in Dublin. The gates and facade would be Ballywater House near Blessington. The side entrance and interiors would be Prior's Land in Carrick Mines. And the garden, with facsimile autograph tree, would be Churchtown House in Dundrum. The key sequence showing young Cassidy's first visit to Coole for a week in June 1924 at Lady Gregory's invitation was based by John Whiting on two sources. On the chapters Blessed Bridget a Coole and Where Wild Swans Nest from Inishfallen Fairly Well, and from the published extracts from Lady Gregory's journals, which had been issued in 1946. In the journals, Whiting found the dialogue about O'Casey's grieving for his mother and beginning to think of Augusta as a maternal figure. As he says in the film, "I haven't felt at home like this for a long, long time, not since my mother." In Inishfallen, Whiting found the arrival along the sweeping drive, as he put it, stretching out her two hands to say with a beaming smile, 1 welcomes, Sean, to the house of Coole. Then Cassidy walking up the stairs past assorted engravings and mezzotints, her demonstration of how to work a newfangled petrol lamp, which goes spectacularly wrong in O'Casey's version, nearly setting fire to the house, the merry talk of books and theatre after supper, the walk in the woods with the old lady, as O'Casey called her, dealing with a mighty thistle by taking an energetic swipe at it. So perish all the king's enemies. And the sacred copper beech with the initials of famous men carved on its trunk. Various changes, though, made their way into Whiting's script, which was approved by O'Casey. Instead of travelling by train from Athenry to Gort with Augusta Gregory in a third-class compartment, which they did, followed by a sidecar from Gort to Coole, in the script, Cassidy travels with his battered suitcase in a jaunting car across two picturesque quiet man bridges, no doubt put in for John Ford's benefit, and he meets Lady Gregory at the front door. At the top of the stairs, Cassidy looks at himself in a mirror, imagines he is Napoleon for a moment, and smiles. There's a bar or two from the Marseillaise on the soundtrack, just as there had been a bar or two of Rule Britannia on the soundtrack of The Informer, as we'll see. The incident with the petrol lamp is now an incident with a silver teapot, and instead of ending with the maid Bridget being ordered to fetch a blanket to put out the fire, it has Cassidy calmly showing off his impressive practical skills. And instead of spending several evenings listening to and sleeping through Lady Gregory reading through Thomas Hardy's play, The Dynasts, his drama of the war with Napoleon, all 130 scenes of it, instead of that, Cassidy responds angrily to a question from Lady Gregory about whether we should write in a special way to appeal to the workers. And instead of a description of the autograph tree and how much it means to Lady Gregory, because it ensures that the guests will be there forever, the script actually has Cassidy signing the tree. Actually, I don't think we know whether he signed it on his first visit or his second and last visit in late August 1925. But above all, John Whiting's screenplay shows how O'Casey's initial reservations and discomfort entering the big house of a representative of the ruling class gradually leads to affection and respect for a remarkable woman at odds with the expectations of her class. The old lady who says yes. As O'Casey later wrote, "I loved her, and I think she was fond of me. Why? God alone knows. Our friendship, affinity, was an odd one. She from affluence, I from poverty. She an aristocrat, I a proletarian communist. And yet we understood each other well." And Edith Evans successfully manages to convey O'Casey's description of a sturdy little figure in her suit of solemn black, enlivened by gleaming eyes and a dancing smile, and a slight Connaught accent. Mercifully, she was not called upon to adopt O'Casey's version of how Lady Gregory spoke, with a lisp and the use of Ds instead of THs. In Young Cassidy, she's like Marjode in John Ford's The Grapes of Wrath, and Beth Morgan, played by Sarah Allgood in How Green Was My Valley, one of Ford's tough, indomitable, and in the end, noble Earth Mothers. When John Ford arrived in Dublin in April 1964, amongst other arguments, he argued with the producers about the structure of the script. He felt there was too much emphasis on Cassidy's love life, including Julie Christie and Maggie Smith, which made him seem a bit like a Dublin version of Tom Jones, which had been a recent film success. In this, did Ford but know it, and not many people know this, there is a distant echo of Lady Gregory's own opinion of the films she saw. During the period she knew Sean O'Casey well, 1924 to 26, according to her journals, she saw 3 films: D.W. Griffith's America, the Zane Grey Wanderer of the Wasteland in colour, and the Barrymore version of Moby Dick. Where all 3 were concerned, she liked the special effects, but felt that the love interest was overdone and spoiled the story, as she reluctantly admitted in her journals, I suppose necessary. She particularly enjoyed the scenes in Wanderer of the Wasteland set in the Arizona desert, a taste for Zane Grey westerns, which she actually shared with W.B. Yeats. But I digress. Back to Dublin in April 1964. At the press conference just before filming began, on July the 9th, 1964, he remained grumpy. A journalist from the London Times asked John Ford intrepidly, "Mr. Ford, can you really speak Irish?" He slowly lifted his eye patch and snapped back, "Where did you get that Ford? O'Feeney to you." To cut a long story short, after 13 working days, on July the 28th, Ford was taken ill with a sore throat and advised by his doctor to withdraw from the production with suspected pneumonia. After a 2-week gap, the direction of the film was taken over at short notice by the well-known cinematographer Jack Cardiff. Ford's contribution to filming amounted to some 20 minutes of screen time, parts of it reshot. And he didn't actually film the Coole Park scene, but he cast it, he planned it, he helped to choose the locations. Jack Cardiff said it was filmed, quote, to Ford's design, and the producers wrote to him while he was convalescing to reassure him that the spirit he'd instilled in the production has been kept. When Young Cassidy opened in February 1965, it was presented on the credits and the posters as a John Ford film, which in many ways it was. And some critics have rated it among the best of his final years. In the second clip, we're going to see that scene at Coole Park. The producers expected Young Cassidy to herald a whole spate of films gathering around the 50th anniversary of Easter 1916, but this didn't happen. But John Ford, throughout his career, had certainly been doing his bit. When he'd filmed The Informer in February 1935, based on Liam O'Flaherty's novel of 1925, They Claimed to Be Distant Cousins, he transposed the story from the 15th of March 1922, after the Anglo-Irish Treaty and the departure of the British, to the very end of the War of Independence. So Jip O'Nolan betrays his IRA comrade in arms, Frankie McPhilip, to the Black and Tans, rather than betraying his anti-treaty comrade to the representatives of the provisional government. And the scriptwriter, Dudley Nichols, wrote that he decided to set the story a bit earlier during, quote, the Irish Revolution Easter trouble, as he put it, because that would make the story more intelligible to movie audiences. Green on green violence was much too complicated. From John Ford's point of view, the film version made it much clearer who were the goodies and who were the baddies. Ford had made a brief pilgrimage, his first since childhood, to his ancestral home in Spiddal in December 1921, when he was 27 years old, during the truce in hostilities leading to the Anglo-Irish Treaty. He described in a long letter to Sean O'Casey in March 1936, written while he was preparing The Plough and the Stars, how he'd seen the ashes of his cousin Mike Thornton's cottage burnt down by the Tans, and how he'd given money and supplies to his activist cousin, Martin Feeney, up in the hills. He'd been followed, he added with a flourish, and watched by the Black and Tans, who'd, quote, roughed him up pretty well, even though he was carrying an American passport, before ordering him to leave the country. And this letter was, of course, intended to establish his credentials with Sean O'Casey, and the story was suitably embellished. But still, the visit of 1921, December, meant a very great deal to him. So he had personal reasons for transposing The Informer, just as he would later transpose Lady Gregory's The Rising of the Moon to the year 1921. Actually, the choice of 1922 rather than 21 for The Informer was an odd one, historically, Because the Black and Tans left on the 16th of January of that year, it should have been captioned 1921, like The Rising of the Moon. The Informer was made with a low budget, no fee for the director, a 3-week shooting schedule, and a rented warehouse rather than a proper studios. And together with his screenwriter, Dudley Nichols, Ford pared down the novel with its flowery language, as he put it, to make it an entirely visual experience. And since they were fans of German expressionist films of the mid to late 1920s, and especially F.W. Murnau's Sunrise of 1927, which Ford reckoned was the greatest motion picture ever produced, they decided with cinematographer Joe August to film The Informer in a similar style. Shadows, thick fog pierced by street lamps, backlighting, unusual camera angles, dissolves, strong visual symbolism, the lot. A dark style for the dark theme of betrayal. Here's the opening sequence coming up, made in February 1935 in that warehouse, with the help of a fog machine, painted flats, and a lot of posters along a painted brick wall. A certain night in strife-torn Dublin, 1922, says the opening caption. O'Flaherty had famously written, "It was 3 minutes to 6 o'clock, the evening of the 15th of March, 1920 blank." Note how the fog is made to symbolize Gippo Nolan's befuddled state of mind, the actively visual presentation of Nolan's memory of his drinking buddy, Frankie McPhillan, the hint of Rule Britannia on the soundtrack, just like the Marseillaise in the film you've just seen, and the way in which the fateful piece of paper clings to Gippo's leg in Ford's Dublin. And the appearance at the end of the clip of Dennis O'Day, who was over in America with the Abbey Players, singing The Rose of Tralee and being given a tip by one of the Tans. Gippo Nolan is played by Victor McLaglen, and he won an Academy Award for this performance. So can we have the third clip, please? Very brief clip, the opening sequence.
Brilliant.
After that, from an aesthetic point of view, John Ford's Ireland came in 2 sizes. One dark, shadowy, nocturnal and expressionist, and the other light, green, sunny and touristy. He felt in retrospect that although The Informer had impressed the critics and indeed the audience, who warmed to the artiness and the stress on the visual rather than the verbal, as he said, it lacked humor, which is my forte. In the same year as John Ford made The Quiet Man in October 1951, together with Lord Killannin and the filmmaker Brian Desmond Hurst, he established 4 Provinces Films based in Galway. The name was, of course, significant, with the intention of making a series of films in Ireland, largely with Irish actors and crew, as a way of stimulating the indigenous film industry. And one of the first projects they discussed was a portmanteau film called 4 Leaves of a Shamrock, which would include short versions of Frank O'Connor's story, The Majesty of the Law, Michael J. McHugh's play, A Minute's Wait, James Joyce's The Dead, and Lady Gregory's The Rising of the Moon. This became 3 Leaves of the Shamrock when they decided against adapting The Dead, and John Huston famously made a wonderful version a lot later. Only one project of the many they planned got off the ground, the Shamrock one, with a screenplay by Frank Nugent of Quiet Man fame. For the sake of my artistic soul, wrote Ford, I love to get back to Ireland. The original idea was to film 3 Leaves of a Shamrock on location in colour and CinemaScope. This was the era of Cinerama Holiday, with Hollywood stars such as Fitzgerald, O'Hara, Donald Crisp, and Alec Guinness. But in the end, budgetary considerations led to filming it in black and white, Ford working for the Guild minimum fee of $3,300, and a cast of Irish stage actors, including Dennis O'Day from The Informer as the police sergeant, now called O'Hara, as in Maureen, Eileen Crowe from The Plough and the Stars and The Quiet Man as his wife, a new character, and Donald Donnelly as the ballad singer. Superstar Tyrone Power would provide introductions to each segment, separately filmed in a Dublin studio by Lord Killannin. At one point, it was suggested that Tyrone Power, who is by now on the board of 4 Provinces Films, should actually play the part of the ballad singer, but Ford put his foot down on that idea. Originally, each segment was to have been introduced by John Ford himself, doing an Alfred Hitchcock, standing outside his ancestral home in Spiddal and reminiscing, but the Tyrone Power introductions worked better, and besides, they provided a box office name for the posters. Ford wanted at the last minute to retitle the film Irish Coffee, but Lord Killannin dissuaded him. The cinematographer they chose was Robert Krasker, best known for The Third Man, 1949, a very significant appointment, as we'll see in a second. And the technical advisors were Ernie O'Malley and Lennox Robinson. Three Leaves of a Shamrock became not Irish Coffee, but The Rising of the Moon. And the final segment of the film, a version of the play, was retitled 1921. It will be filmed in 1957 and bookended by a sung version of the ballad. The original one-act play by Lady Gregory, as I'm sure you know, written in July 1903 and first performed in 1907, was, as she put it, set in the historical time of the Fenians in the 1860s. But the real fight goes on in the sergeant's head. The Rising of the Moon, the play, took its title and its theme from John Keegan Casey's ballad, compiled around 1867, the time of the betrayed Fenian uprising, which referred back to a battle between United Irishmen and the British in 1798. And it tended to be sung to the tune of The Wearing of the Green. And as we've heard, Lady Gregory's memoirs and her journals and introductions to her plays mention various inspirations for this play, looking at Galway jail when she was a child, a story told to her by her nursemaid Mary Sheridan about a United Irishman, and a more contemporary incident involving Thomas O'Concannon, a Gaelic League organiser, whose bicycle broke down in Kinvara on the way to Coole, and in conversation, a helpful local policeman showed, quote, national sympathies under his tunic. And Lady Gregory wove all these inspirations into a ballad-like play, which has the straightforwardness of a folk tale from the oral tradition. And we all know the story. The play may also embody, it has been suggested, the two conflicting sides of Lady Gregory's personality, the representative of law and order and the childhood rebel. As a ballad-like play, it connected the audience with popular memory and patriotic emotion, as ballads did, with the kind of history, as Lady Gregory put it, that was shut out of the schools. And as we've heard, it was controversial. Some people thought the policeman was a traitor, and others thought that he was much too nice. But after 1907, it became the most revived of all Lady Gregory's plays in its own right, rather than as a curtain raiser to the verse dramas, and a staple of the Abbey's repertory, which is why it was so well known to Irish American audiences. John Ford's version makes some very substantial changes and transforms the ballad-like structure into something much more explicit, dark, and complicated. Half the screen time is taken up with the elaborate escape of Sean Curran, he's given a name, from Galway jail, involving two actresses from Taviot Theatre who masquerade as nuns. One of them produces an American passport, just as John Ford did in 1921. Crowds of mourners praying in long lines outside the castle, expecting an execution at any moment, and a confused but quite sympathetic British officer who is at odds with the brutish black and tans. 4 years of war and I end up a hangman. And a prison warder played by Joseph O'Day, who acts the dummy and pretends to be a stage Irishman to put the authorities off the scent. All of this was based on just one line of the play. There isn't another man in Ireland would have broken jail the way he did. He must have some friends among the jailers. These scenes are filmed by Robert Krasker in expressionist style, tilted camera, shadows, high contrast, third man style compositions, harking right back to The Informer. The segment opens with a wanted poster, £100 reward this time, just as the earlier film did, with a photograph on it, which makes the ensuing story rather far-fetched. When the film finally reaches the quayside halfway through, there are even more changes. John Ford indulges his taste for blunt knockabout comedy, as he put it, some of it improvised, by having the RIC police constable throw a pile of posters in the water, misunderstanding the sergeant's remark, stick 'em where you like, by adding a photogenic donkey, by including an important new character, the sergeant's wife, complete with some jokes about her cookery and gallivanting at my age, by naming the ballad singer Sean Curran, the Sergeant O'Hara, and the seaport town of the script of the play, Galway, filmed on location around the Spanish Arch by showing a gun pointing at the head of the police constable. And although he keeps the famous punchline, "I wonder now, am I as great a fool as I think I am?" he precedes it with a donkey joke. It was a jackass ye heard braying it. And in this version, it's made clear that there's a Yankee freighter in the harbour waiting for Sean to row out. So Lady Gregory's ballad-like play has turned into something else. It's become the one and only time John Ford combined his two visual images of Ireland, the dark and expressionist and dangerous, and the light, green and fun-loving. It added comedy to a story about an informer, a potential informer, which Ford felt his 1935 film had lacked. It's as if Jip O'Nolan decided to forego his informer's reward for the sake of the old country. And The Rising of the Moon became a revisiting of, almost a reply to, The Informer, which it references several times with a bit of The Quiet Man tacked on for good measure. It also reminded Ford of his visit to Spiddal in late 1921, which he would have explained himself in shot if he had in fact introduced it. And all in all, The Rising of the Moon, John Ford's version, reminded viewers in the mid-1950s why the play had come to be treated as a nationalist text half a century before. Ford must have smiled when the 1921 segment was indeed banned in Belfast in 1957. John Ford's film of The Rising of the Moon usually gets a couple of lines at most in biographies and editions of Lady Gregory. And in books about John Ford, it gets a page at most. But I'd argue that it deserves a lot more. He customized the script, handpicked the actors, partly produced the film, and his stamp is on every frame. And for those who want to see The Rising of the Moon, we have it complete. It lasts for half an hour, this segment, which we'll do after the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christopher. That was a wonderful topic again. Gregory's relationship there with John Ford, or John Ford's relationship with Lady Gregory. So I'm going to ask now, thank you. We are over time, but that's understandable considering the absolutely brilliant illuminations that have taken place this evening. So I'm going to ask all the speakers to now put themselves on camera. And could anybody in the audience please type your question in and I will read it out. There are a number of, so let's get the speakers back on camera, and that would be great. There is a question I'd like, so yeah, let me just see now. So I welcome all questions to any of our speakers about anything. There is a for Christopher from Lorna Kennedy, which came in earlier today, asking in anticipation of Christopher Freiling's talk, can he say why John Ford's depiction of Lady G's Rising of the Moon was titled 1921? It's insensitive, as that was the year that Lady G's daughter-in-law was the sole survivor of an ambush in which the four friends were murdered.
Yes, I sort of dealt with that in the talk, I think, for two main reasons. One, because Ford had this extraordinary visit to Spiddal in the end of 1921, which stayed in his mind. And because he was completely obsessed with telling the story of the Irish Revolution as Black and Tans versus the IRA, which he'd done with The Informer and which he kept coming back to. And so he decided, for reasons best known to himself, to tack on this prologue to The Rising of the Moon, which locates it within that very, very dark and very difficult period and shoots it in a dark expressionist style. And the camera's tilted all over the place, just like watching The Informer. So it was insensitive when you think about it from that point of view, although I don't think John Ford would have known that biographical detail necessarily. But he wanted to give the play more punch, to make it less of a jolly one-act play, and to be the climax of these 3 leaves of the Shamrock. It's the final of the 3 stories. He wanted the audience to leave feeling they've been hit in the solar plexus by watching this film. And it's not easy to do with The Rising of the Moon. It's a gentle ballad-like play, but he managed to really give it a kick by adding this prologue. Now, whether as Lady Gregory fans, we think it was a travesty, or whether, you know, it would have been much better if he'd filmed it in Quiet Man style in a much more sort of gentle and charming way, maybe. But that's what he did. And I think I understand the reasons why he did it. He wanted to give it punch. He felt the play had become too cozy. And that's what he succeeded in doing, I think. It still packs a punch.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Christopher. The image of Lady Gregory, of her looking at us with her typewriter in the act of writing, has really struck a chord with so many of us this evening. So there's been a lot of chat about that online. And Ella Swift is asking if Barry, or indeed any of us, knows, is that her typewriter? Did she travel with that? Or was that a prop for the photo? Or has anybody got any information on the typewriter, or specifically in that photo?
I tried turning volume.
Well, I can maybe offer a little bit on that. I believe it was hers. It's in a traveling case.
Yay.
On the image, when it was on screen, you can see the wooden box around it. So yeah, I think it's something that she's obviously very comfortable working on as well. So I think there is a familiarity around it. But yeah, it was a great one to turn up. And if anyone has other information on it, I'd equally know.
Yeah,
thank you. I think I put it in the chat. There was an interesting moment from Kieran's research, I guess, where in the moment where there's the coming together for the first time of the mission statement, in a way, with Edward Martin and herself and Yeats at Durras, I believe it was at Durras House in the late 1800s, where in the show, at least, we said, and so, you know, I took out my typewriter, which Lady Layard had given to me, and with sort of great excitement at having the machine and being able to, you know, being a slow typist, she talks about herself as being slow at it, but thrilled to have it. So I don't know if it's the same typewriter, but anyway, I thought that was always a fun moment.
So it almost certainly was, because you compare the typeface of the letter she wrote from the USA, it's the same as what she's writing from Cool. So
amazing.
Seems like a certainty.
That's beautiful forensics there, James. There's nothing like a bit of forensic evidence. That is really exciting. Thank you. So we have a couple of minutes, because we are over time. We have a couple of minutes left for questions, but if you don't mind, I would like to ask Una a question about something you mentioned, Una, earlier, when you're approaching your creation of the role, and you mentioned being intrigued and fascinated by Cuchulainn Marhimne. Could you just say why? What was it about? What is it about that book, and what did it give you for the role, please?
Well, I actually had had studied Irish at Trinity. So, and I had taught Irish in secondary school for a couple of years before I came to America. So I have a long-standing love of the language, and had spent time in Connemara, more time in Kerry, actually, in the Gaeltacht. But I guess I had been away. It may have been, you know, I wondered at the time if it had to do with being migrant and rose-tinted glasses. You know, you look back as you become more distant from the land that you've left. And I wondered about that for myself, but the language struck me so much. I said in the chat, there's an expression, "Tá dul na Gaeilge air." It has the way of Irish. It has the way that you would go on in Irish. It has the go of Irish in it. And I felt that was more authentic in how she, the voice of it all, in the telling. And it was very emotional to me at the time. I was doing a study. I was teaching a little bit at SUNY Purchase, and I gave some talks on Cuchulainn, and it was very, very feeding to me at the time. And there's just the spirit of the language was so incredible. And I absolutely loved that in reading Macdonough's Wife, and the curses in Macdonough's Wife, reading the Workhouse Ward yesterday, reading it again. I was so fed by that through my preparation. I mean, when I talked about it earlier, it's just impossible to talk about the things that there are these little whispers, really little strands of things that you that you catch on to or that feed you in different ways as an actor, at different times. One of them was her statement about herself in 70 years when I was reading that autobiography, her autobiography, where she just talked about going fishing with her father and kind of grappling with the whole church, the sort of structures of the church, and coming to this very deep peace in terms of her own faith. Very understated, but that was a tremendous thing for me through the whole production. So it's very elusive, really, what these little whispers are that you get.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating. We have time for one last question. So it's coming from Adrian Patterson, and it's asking James, or indeed everyone. So we'll open up to all our speakers. Lady Gregory's sense of service is great and a real motivator for much of her work. I wonder, can you talk a little about the difference between this kind of writing in which selfhood is somehow subsumed and the very personal work, the poems, for instance? Do the two become merged, say, after 1900? I'd ask James first, perhaps, and then if any of the other speakers would like to talk about that, that'd be great.
That's such an awkward and great question. Well, the title of my doctoral thesis, written many years ago, is A Dialogue of Self and Service, is the main title. Lady Gregory's emergence as an Irish writer and her collaboration with Yeats, right? The two things, or are those one thing, her becoming a writer and her working with Yeats. And I think, the quickest answer I can give is that she is always so invested in those moments when she's asserting herself most directly to provide some kind of cover, maybe a cloak, the metaphor for today. I'm thinking of things like the preface to Cathal na Mhaithne. If the scholarly men in Trinity College had done their work, it wouldn't have been left to a woman of the house who has to be minding, looking after food and all the rest of it. Or let's take something from later in her career, the opening of her autobiography, 70 Years, that's 20 years later, where she says, I'm writing it for my grandchildren, right? It's my children, my grandchildren. And all these things that she does, it kind of blunts and disguises what could otherwise be seen as egotism on her part. And the reasons for that, given the gender politics of the island of the time, are clear enough, aren't they? But Adrian's question asks something more awkward than that, interesting. It's just a great question, Adrian. Again, with a quick answer, it's telling, isn't it, that those personal poems she never publishes, right? And if you go through the voluminous drafts of 70 Years, it runs for boxes. What's she cutting out? It's always the personal. Do I go too far? What have I shown here? And it's no coincidence that her affair with John Quinn is not figured out until many years later. The affair with Blunt, not till many years later. These things are guarded. So that'd be the quick answer. And she becomes more skilled in what you term the merging after 1900. She can work for herself and for Yeats. She can work for herself and Ireland. She can work for herself and Douglas Hyde at the same time. And very, very successfully.
But can I just say that said, in her introductions to her plays and in her memoir, subsequently published, she is at pains to point out the personal sources of something like The Rising of the Moon. I mean, she doesn't say this play is a riff on the wording of rebel songs and so on. What she says is it's a childhood memory. It's something my nursemaid said to me when I was little, and it's something that happened to me recently when someone was coming to visit Cool. So she's very clear that her personal life is within these plays. If you care to decode them, I know it's not up front, and as you say, there's all sorts of smoke screens to sort of hide behind. But that's quite an unusual thing for a playwright to do. I think most playwrights talk about the great writers they've been reading. She doesn't do that. She says this is personal reminiscence.
And there are those really telling moments crucial moment, crucial crises within the Abbey Theatre, or Hugh Lane getting turned down for the directorship of the National Gallery originally. Those moments, there's an essay she writes in 1908. Sinn Féin is good enough for the day's bread, but in things of art, it's Misha Féin, right? It's egotistical, it has to be. And she recognizes the utility of supporting that in Yeats, but knows it has to be true also for herself in the end, if she's going to get her own writing done.
Yeah.
Una,
you want to come in there?
I think that is beautifully said by both of you, that I feel that there was not a contradiction in her about self or other in a certain way. It was wordless, a kind of a very deep in the DNA, in her bones, to serve the vision of another, her own. It really didn't have walls and compartments between them. And I think that the sort of submission of self I feel it was not in her conception. Maybe it was because of the politics of the time, but I think it had to do more with the kind of woman that she was. In a nod to my mother, it's interesting. My mother raised 7 children who are all indomitable, actually, I have to say. At home, never left the home, really. And when I talked to her once, she said, "Oh, I never felt there was anything that I couldn't do." Wow. She didn't go out and have a public life in a certain way, but somehow we got that. It was just in the bones. And I felt that very much in her bones. There weren't categories to self-service, service of others. It was a service to some vision and putting something forward and moving things forward through art, through folklore, through the garden, through trees, through a legacy. I just feel like it was not a contradiction for her.
Thank you so much, Una. And you spoke earlier, Una, about trying to locate your connection with her from the inside out. And that really speaks very strongly to that sense that her whole being, work, and everything is the inside out, and that dichotomy of public, private, self, other, all of that, in a sense, is a very organic, very complex, but organic thing within her. So we're out of time now in terms of the questions and answers. So I just want to thank all of our speakers for their absolutely stunning contributions tonight and groundbreaking. The new knowledges that we have learned tonight and the wonderful perspectives that are again new. So I want to thank you all for a very moving, emotional and illuminating evening. So I'm going to so thank you all so much. And now I'm going to hand back to Ronnie and Marion and say that I hope we can all meet in real life this time next year. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Melissa. Absolutely a beautiful evening. A sincere thank you to all of our speakers. Again, just the associations and the links that Melissa herself highlighted between the different speakers, the new information, it's just infinite, the amount of joy and knowledge that we gain from this amazing lady. And one thing, may I say, it's such an honor also to have the family represented. I know Lauren and Ben, Jane, David, I'm not sure who else might be lurking out there in Zoom land. And thank you all for bearing with Zoom. It's not something that I think Gregory would be kind of chuffed, and if it wasn't for people like Manus Goen, who has done a great job with the video, but in particular, I want to acknowledge Ben O'Gorman. Where are you, Ben? Come over here. Come over here. Who has done all the techie bits for us. Thank you, Ben. Isn't it great?
Well, I would like to say a word about the chairperson. I always think being a chair is very, very difficult, but Melissa wonderfully knits it all together. And there was a fluidity about this evening's talks and lectures, apart from their, intelligence and erudition and the knowledge I have gained of Gregory. I really loved your phrase about, she's looking us in the eye again. And I felt that very strongly at the Druid the Druid Gregory, the plays. I was very moved by those plays. I was very moved by their location, of course, but the location is important. The environment, the landscape is important, very, very important. And I do thank Luke Morgan for those wonderful films that he shows us, which we're going to end by showing them again. But I thought Rod Taylor as the young Cassidy was quite good. That little scene was very intimate, sitting by the fire. You know, Gregory was that as well, you know, a complex person, as many people are. But Melissa, you did a wonderful job in bringing out that. And I do feel, you know, Gregory is more alive than ever. I really thank our speakers and thank you very, very much indeed.
We have one hidden speaker, Kieran, that you mentioned, Una, who scripted and pulled a lot together. And I think one thing that came through here was a very personal, intimate view of Gregory that's places her much more in the modern world, if you wish, not trying to do it overtly, but just, you know, she fits. And the woman had far more purpose than she was credited with. Yes. Was far greater a playwright, a writer, as James said, in terms of her short stories, the possibility of being a really good fiction writer. And you know, Barry with the production, and it's just amazing, isn't it? And it's such a pleasure for us, because every year there's an infinite possibility.
Yes. And I have James's book to get, which I look forward to getting. Listen, we're going to close now, and we're going to close just with two things are going to happen. We're going to go back to Luke Morgan's, just looking at the evening in Cool, just very short music by Manus Gowan has knitted it in beautifully. And then after that, we're going to show at least a half an hour of the rising of the moon. And I think it'll be worth seeing. So again, everybody, thank you. Thank you very much for coming.
Absolutely.
Wonderful speakers, really. I'm sorry we can't applaud you, but hopefully next year we'll have both a physical gathering and a Zoom gathering. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, would you keep talking?
The wonders of Zoom, would you keep talking?
Yes, I know.
Well,
Well,
okay.
if you-
Now, Ronnie, may I
No, we
just say
said-
one thing to echo where we started from, which is probably, you know, not only did Lady Gregory inspire everybody here and all the other offshoots, but also Lois that we honored, whom we honored at the beginning. We're so thrilled that Sean could join us, and Siobhan, her daughter from London. And I personally owe a huge debt of gratitude to Lois for having invited me to help her with this originally all those years ago. And it's just been immeasurable. And I hope all of you, be it speaker or participant, have also each year gained something from it in terms of connections you've made with people, more knowledge that you've picked up, more insights into Gregory or Robert or whoever, you know, that we've touched on. It just seems infinite, and we're truly privileged and honored to have that. So thank you.
Okay. Once another look.